ποιήσεν αυτής κρίμα εγγραπτών, δόξα αυτή εστε πάση η σωσή.
Welcome to the True Orthodox channel, the voice of true orthodoxy. Our channel shares information and inspiration from true orthodoxy, and the Russian True Orthodox Church, RTOC, whose present first hierarch is Archbishop Tikhon of Omsk and Siberia.
Antony, Archbishop of Arkhangelsk and those with him. Archbishop Antony, in the world Nicholas Mikhailovich Bystrov, was born in 1858 in Solvykogorsk, Arkhangelsk province. In 1879 he graduated from the Vologda Theological Seminary, and was appointed a reader in one of the churches of Vologda diocese. In 1882 he was ordained to the priesthood. In 1888, after the death of his wife, he received the monastic tonsure. In 1889, he became superior of the Kandikovsky Grigorievo-Pelshemsky Lopatov monastery in Vologda diocese. In 1890 he was transferred to the Kornilievo-Komelsky monastery in the same diocese. In 1892 he was raised to the rank of igumen, and in 1906 became an archimandrite. In 1907 he became superior of the Vologda Holy Spirit monastery. On January 17/30, 1910 he was consecrated Bishop of Velsk, a vicariate of the Vologda diocese. In 1921 he became Bishop of Arkhangelsk and Kholmogorsk. From no later than July 1922 to the beginning of 1925 he was in exile in the Nerinsk region, Tomsk province. In November 1926 he was interrogated in connection with the case of the union of clergy and laity in Arkhangelsk. In 1926 or 1927 he was raised to the rank of archbishop. On January 5/18, 1932, Archbishop Antony celebrated the all-night vigil in the only church which still remained unclosed in the city of Arkhangelsk. During his sermon he touched in passing on the question of the restriction of freedom with regard to the holding of church services. That night, Vladimir received a visit from the superintendent of the GPU's Department of Church Affairs, who had himself previously been a theology student. A search was begun which lasted from 11 o'clock at night until 4 o'clock in the morning. Vladimir had never meddled in politics, and nothing was discovered during the search. When the search had come to an end, the inspector, taking up the case containing the holy gifts, began to play with it, tossing it back and forth. "Citizen Inspector," Vladimir said simply, "the church forbids laymen to touch the holy gifts." With a malicious laugh the inspector cast the holy gifts to the floor and began to trample them underfoot. Vladimir threw himself to the floor and tried to cover them with his body, to protect them from profanation. While this was going on, he lost consciousness. As soon as he came to himself, soldiers dragged him off to prison. He was accused of sheltering and helping churchmen exiled to the northern regions. Vladimir used to give alms to exiled priests at the doors of the church, and allowed the exiled Lyagelev to lead a choir in the Resurrection Church which many exiled clergy joined. The only thing Vladimir took with himself was his hierarchical staff. In prison they demanded that he remove his panagia and cross, but he refused, saying, "I am a minister of God and dare not remove my cross. If you do not dare, then we will do it for you." They replied, and ripped the cross from him by force. The cell in which they imprisoned Vladimir was very small, having approximately 2 square meters of floor space. There were already 7 prisoners within, mostly thieves. The imprisonment of clergymen, or, in general, persons of high spiritual attainments, in the same cell with criminals was one of the GPU's most frequently employed methods, the hope being that the criminals will specially torment such prisoners. But this time matters turned out quite differently. The criminals greeted the elder bishop kindly. For the 8 men incarcerated in the cell there were only 3 bed frames covered with plain canvas. One of the thieves, the fortunate owner of one of these berths, wished to sell it to the archbishop, but when Vladika declared that he had no money, the thief surrendered the berth free of charge. Among the prisoners one of the most obnoxious was a laborer, who had been cast into prison for ridiculing the Soviet regime while drunk. Even more malicious was a soldier of the Red Army, who said that he had been imprisoned for refusing to execute people. In actual fact he was a thief, and subsequently stole Vladika's linen. He had been promised his freedom, if he was able to procure incriminating material against Vladika and other clergymen. Each cell of the Soviet prison had its own traitor, its own Judas, and prisoners had to be on their guard at all times. During the first few days of his imprisonment, Vladika was fed with salted herring, but was, at the same time, refused water with which to wash it down. After several days of subsisting on this fare, they summoned him to his first interrogation, which lasted for 17 hours without a pause. Vladika was accused of supporting counter-revolutionary clergymen. By this the authorities had in mind the alms he gave to the unfortunates on the church porch. But accuser and accused knew that there was not a word of truth in the accusation, since the poor priests received alms openly at the church doors. The only real assistance Vladika accorded them was to put them up for the night, to save them from the cold which reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit. In view of the fact that the interrogation was not amounting to anything, they submitted 3 questions for Archbishop Antony to answer. 1. What was his opinion of the state of the Church under the Soviet regime? 2. What was his opinion concerning the future of the Church in Russia? And 3. Did he desire the overthrow of the Soviet regime? To these questions Vladika answered in writing as follows. 1. Externally, the state of the Church in Russia is grave, yet, despite this, the grace of God is disclosed therein. 2. Through the suffering of her martyrs, the Church, as in the first centuries of Christianity, shall be glorified. And 3. I daily entreat the Lord to forgive the Soviet government its sins and pray that it shed no more blood. Vladika was again taken away to his cell. The 3 months following his interrogation passed tolerably. Prisoners were permitted to receive food and clothing from their relatives. A doctor visited them, who, though his skill was not of the highest caliber, was nonetheless able to obtain the necessary medicines for the prisoners. Vladika, who was loved and respected in the city, received a large parcel, but of its contents he retained for himself only the sugar, linen and soap, leaving all the rest for those who were imprisoned with him. He even shared with them his prison rations, which amounted to 300 grams of bread, a soup stock made of fish bones, and buckwheat prepared without any oil or lard. Most difficult for Vladika was the lack of fresh air and of books. Exceedingly irritating was the above-mentioned worker, who either spent his time mocking the Soviet regime or weeping like an old woman. While Vladika slept, the other prisoners often beat this worker. Vladika read and explained the gospel to his fellow prisoners, most of whom had become criminals simply because they had been raised without any religious training. Many of them thus became acquainted with the gospel for the first time in their lives. And Vladika did not limit himself to preaching, for by his meekness and kindness he gave them an example of the exalted Christian life. In amazement the young prisoners watched how the venerable old bishops rose at night, and knelt in prayer for long periods of time. Passion Week arrived, and Vladika kept the fast strictly. At that time he was summoned to the interrogator a second time. This man, threatening him with his revolver, demanded that Vladika acknowledge his guilt. With caustic wit he told them, "Your Eminence will sit in prison until such time as you recognize yourself as guilty." At that time they also promised Vladika complete freedom and restoration to his position, on condition that he agree to become an agent of the GPU. This proposition Vladika indignantly refused. When the interrogator perceived that neither threats nor inducements had any effect on Vladika, he commanded that he be taken to a cell in a stone building which had just been constructed. Its walls were so damp that water ran off them in streams. The delivery of clothing and food to the prisoners was discontinued. The doctor no longer put in an appearance. In the little cell there were with Vladika 5 peasants from the Ukraine who had run away from a camp of exiles. The atmosphere in the damp cell became unbearably oppressive, a problem which was compounded by the stench of 6 long unwashed human bodies. It was impossible to procure soap or a change of underclothes. A malodorous latrine bucket stood in the corner. Twice a day the prisoners were given a glass of water each. As summer wore on, there were some days when the prisoners did not even have the strength to converse. They would sit for hours on end, slumped against the wall, gulping the foul air like fish out of water. Their clothing had long since been reduced to rags. The number of fleas and lice multiplied not from day to day, but from hour to hour. Scurvy set in, and the prisoners' teeth fell out, their swollen members were covered with black and blue sores. Wounds which the Ukrainians had received in World War I, and which had long since scarred over, opened up again. One of them died waiting for a doctor. The corpse remained in the cell for a full 24 hours. When they had removed the body of the dead man, they incarcerated his son in his place. Vladika lay on the floor, since there the vermin were less active than on the berths. He was tormented dreadfully by thirst, and had grown so weak that he could not even pick the insects from his beard by himself, and they infested his mouth, nose and ears. The other prisoners helped him as best they could. From time to time he lost consciousness. One day another bishop was imprisoned in the same cell, and the dying man was able to make his confession. Soon after, Archbishop Antony contracted dysentery and lost blood in increasingly large quantities. Finally, he was taken to the prison infirmary, already unconscious. There he survived only a few hours more. Regaining consciousness, he marshaled his remaining strength and read the prayers for the departure of the soul himself. Hieromartyr Antony died on July 3/16, 1932 in the hospital of the Interrogation prison in Arkhangelsk. When the bishop who had confessed him heard of the death of Vladimir Antony, he intoned the words from the funeral service, "They that preached the Lamb of God and like lambs were slain." News of the death of its beloved bishop quickly spread throughout the city. The request to obtain the body for burial was refused. 2 women who kept watch over the prison gates saw how, one moonlit night, the naked body of the archbishop was dragged out and buried by the Chekists without a coffin. In the cemetery church in which the late archbishop had celebrated his last service, the people gathered for a funeral service. In place of a coffin, the square table used as a candle stand during services for the departed was placed in the middle of the church, and on it were placed the archbishop's mitre, flanked by the Dicerion and Tricerion with which the departed was wont to bless the people. The rite was served by the priests who were in exile in Arkhangelsk at that time. When they chanted, "Come ye, let us give one last kiss to the departed, O brethren." All those present surged toward the little table and, sobbing, kissed what little remained to them on earth of their beloved archpastor. Eugene Alexandrovich Dyagilev was a choir master. Until 1931 he was in exile in Arkhangelsk. He worked in the Resurrection Church in Arkhangelsk. On December 2, 1931 he was condemned by the OPU for participation in a counter-revolutionary grouping of the local exiled clergy in Arkhangelsk. He was sentenced to imprisonment in a labor camp and exile in the northern region. While in exile, he directed a choir that was joined by many exiled clergy.